Captain's Log, subdate 200422.2. I have heard it on the grapevine, Twitter, that there is legitimacy to the rise of imaginary friends. So I have tried and decided to embrace this. But every time I have done so, the imaginary friend has killed themselves. I can't imagine why. Welcome everyone to the 17th Halls of Injustice. Today, I guess you could say, the culprits are everyone, except for those who have been, courtesy of the courts, deemed victim. But because this particular set of events goes back over a decade and spans multiple cities, which would include Rochdale, Rotherham, Newcastle, Keighley, Peterborough, Oxford, Bristol and Aylesbury, with numbers of victims reaching the thousands in one city alone, this one is a colossal failure on a scale that should shame hundreds, nay thousands, of politicians, police officers, legal professionals, and people in society who thought the best way to handle this was to ignore it for the sake of community cohesion and, of course, adherence to cultural norms, because nothing reeks of normal more than having thousands of victims of one crime perpetuated by one community in such a way and to such a scale that it caused unending agony, harm, torment, and loss of life because of it. That just totes sounds normal to me. I'm going to read a list of names for you. Abdul Rauf, Hamid Safi, Mohammed Sajid Abdul Aziz, Abdul Karim Adil Khan, Mohammed Amin Kabir Hassan. These names are those who have been convicted of crimes related to certain gangs of the GROOMING type. But while they are guilty and all sentenced to life, there are many more, by the way, who were arrested and jailed. I've covered them before. There are others involved in all of this that I firmly believe need to now stand and be held to account, not in a committee, but for perverting the course of justice, either by willful ignorance or by actually acknowledging it and choosing to ignore it. That would include people within the Met, and that I mean not Met Office, but the Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, anyone who is law enforcement that turned a blind eye to it because they were told to by politicians. The same politicians who did not know how to properly deal with it because they had pigeonholed themselves. The buzzword that made it impossible for them to go near this subject was Islamophobia, because to call something out based on faith and the reaction it got made it so that police officers and politicians were afraid. MPs, peers, police officers, Crown Prosecution Service chose to instead say they just didn't believe that this was happening because optics. I don't care for optics, I care for the facts. In one of the more recent articles that got my attention, it was revealed how one teenage girl who was a victim of this was grilled by 11 barristers for 6 days and they just continually called her a liar. But thanks to her courage, she didn't back down and gave up front all the facts of what she had to endure. The article that caught my attention that reminded me of all of this concerned two girls who were sat outside the Sexual Health Support Service Centre run by Sarah Rowbotham, who upon arriving to work saw the two girls shivering sitting on the steps. They had been waiting for hours because on the night before they were dumped on the moors after having been violently raped by several men. As a crisis intervention coordinator for the NHS, it was Rowbotham's work with vulnerable young girls that had begun to shed light on a series of crimes happening in the Rochdale area. She presented these reports to the authorities. She relayed details of the girls being plied with alcohol, coerced into having unprotected sex, many of whom were more than 30 years older than them. She told of the underage girls being threatened, picked up in car parks, taken to houses across town and passed around by dozens of men. In one case, there was a man in his 40s pouring petrol on the head of a 14-year-old girl with learning difficulties and threatening to set her alight unless she performed an act on him. But those complaints were dismissed and ignored. Rowbotham's efforts to get justice ignored. In 2009, the CPS decided not to pursue the cases in court, describing the girls as not credible. The very authorities that are meant to protect these people have judged the girls promiscuous teenagers who are making lifestyle choices by engaging in activity with these men, with some being described by police officers as scrubbers. These girls felt the society had treated them as invisibles. 2 years later, Nazir Afzal came before the chief prosecutor for North West England and took a controversial decision to reopen the cases. He admits he didn't know, but fighting for justice for those girls would become one of the most challenging and difficult and dangerous episodes of his career. And what drew his attention to it was that a newspaper investigation did go into how gangs of mainly Pakistani men were targeting predominantly underage white girls for sex. It did in fact expose a scandal in Rotherham and started to make deeply disturbing connections with similar patterns of this elsewhere, which is where I mentioned all those cities and towns. In Before Someone Says It, yes, happens with a few other religions in the United Kingdom. In fact, it has happened quite a lot. Not focusing on that, thank you for the distraction. Back on topic. Over the course of the article, Nazir Afzal does go into greater detail about how he handled this. And while this did happen many years before the Me Too movement, he did notice the seismic cultural shift and empowerment that this movement embodied didn't really start in Hollywood. Because it didn't, did it? People started to come forward with this kind of stuff, but they were choosing to be ignored because, and then you insert optics. What I find really fascinating about this article is the detail and the struggle Nazir Afzal went through to get this through, to get this started, detailing how the prosecution dealt with each individual case, but then also how the defense chose, instead of dealing with the evidence presented, to discredit those that experienced it because, and then insert character assassination here, which is what it all boiled down to. David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, even he called Nazir Afzal to ask how widespread a problem the gangs were, with Nazir Afzal replying that this is a deep-rooted issue that cannot be ignored and not enough attention had been paid to nationwide. So eventually this all went public. And Nazir Afzal went very public, saying that I'm the chief Crown Prosecutor for the North West, and I can tell you that the decisions in 2009 taken by the police and prosecutors not to prosecute this case were wrong. Which he was right. Damn right he was right. I like him as a judge. Judge Afzal. Let's go with that. Because he's put away so many of these disgusting, vile, less than human beings. Those that would take the humanity of others under the guise of, but my balls are full, yo. You are not a person. You are an object for my amusement. Which is, by the way, to those police officers that hid like cowards. To the CPS that hid and cowered. The politicians that thought instead, let's tweet about how we want structural cohesion for the community, so you may want to shut up, Rotherham girls. Not a normal cultural thing in the United Kingdom, is it now? If anyone thinks it is, you're not very English now, are you? I say English explicitly because all these towns are in England. That's not to say it hasn't happened in Scotland, because there's a rise of it there, or Wales or Northern Ireland. But the biggest culprits are in England. So let's quickly go through the list of how many people there have been harmed. Shall we? Because this is pretty brutal. Rotherham. A 2014 inquiry found there were more than 1,400 victims of this between 1997 and 2013. Rochdale. A trial of 9 Asian men for grooming young white girls received jail sentences between 4 and 19 years. Oxford. 5 members of a sadistic ring were handed life sentences. And it went into detail how girls aged between 11 and 15 were plied with alcohol and drugs and then being forced to perform acts. Bristol. 13 Somali men were jailed for more than a total of 100 years after running an inner-city ring. Aylesbury. 6 men jailed in 2015. And in Peterborough, a total of 10 men were convicted for crimes on children, which is absolutely sickening. And as anyone knows, Newcastle is the more recent to be added to the list. Pretty sickening, right? Yeah. Nazir Afzal should be knighted for what he did. Truly, genuinely he should be. But I doubt he will, because how can you do that to somebody who put so many innocent martyrs away? If it isn't obvious enough, I am not best impressed with how everything happened. And as a judge, it is my job to pass sentence. Some of the courts in the United Kingdom have passed sentence, and I read them out a moment ago. Here's mine. Life, without the possibility of parole. See if you can get out of that. Oh, and as the police, the CPS, the politicians, the peers, failed these people, failed thousands of people, innocent lives, failed, harmed, irreparably harmed, damaged in such a way that the courts are so busy trying to get a father who's only a father because he sexually abused somebody, the rights to see a kid that doesn't even want to see him. That's not even a joke, by the way. That's something I covered on this channel. Since you're so busy dealing with that, I hereby sentence all of you to share prison cells with each and every one of those people for the rest of your lives as well. Nothing can truly undo the damage that was done, but the job of this country isn't to abandon people. It is to support each other like communities are meant to. And you failed them. You make me sick. The only reason I haven't said death penalty, by the way, is because that's an easy way out. And I don't want a single one of you to get an easy way out.